As we face yet another year of potential cutbacks and painful decisions, the legislature needs clear, accurate information about what the state departments are doing to accomplish their mission in a changing state as we seek to provide the best services at the lowest cost. Performance measurement, in its simplest definition, is simply documenting a department's ability to meet its goals. Through performance measurement, we can provide a better understanding of the important jobs state government does and make more informed decisions as we craft a new budget. It allows us to provide the leadership and management of the state and through policy direction through the resources that we oversee. Last year, I joined many of my fellow committee members as a principal co-author of SB 14, a bill that would have begun the performance-based budgeting process in California. Now, while the veto of that was disappointing, the reality is because we in the legislature, members, control the budget process, we don't have to wait for a bill or a ballot measure or even the governor to begin a performance-based budgeting effort. Ultimately, performance-based budgeting is about exerting leadership, and that's something we can do right here on this panel. It's something that the administration is starting to do through executive order and that we can just move forward on. What I hope we can show with this year through the subcommittee's work is that, again, we don't need a special amendment. We can just move forward. As we will see today and in the coming months, many state departments and agencies already practice some form of performance measurement. So the opportunity right in front of us is to capitalize on a lot of work that's already being done. And again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to see the wheels that are out there and try to make it better. The goals for today's hearing, some of the main questions I hope we can explore are three basic ones. One, what type of measurements are useful to the legislature in making budget decisions? Two, how many measures should each department have? As Caltrans will indicate, they have 55 performance measurements. This is a wealth of information, but the question is whether it's helpful for the legislature to hear about all of these measurements or if it's more useful for us to ask departments to give us their top 2 or 3 measurements and how they're faring on those goals. So we'll discuss that. And we're going to also, thirdly, what is the best process for settling performance measurements for departments? How do we measure those performance measurements? How do we set them? Does a sub-6 discussion work best because it draws on the assembly budget leaders? Or is it better for each subcommittee to oversee their own departments separately? Or maybe we should adopt a model like the California proposed to empower a working group to develop measures. We can talk about all these different alternatives. The format today, we're going to hear from 3 different witnesses. We've asked the Department of Finance first to describe its progress in implementing an executive order to enact Governor Brown's decision in December requiring development of strategies to incorporate program evaluation into the budget process, something we're very grateful that he's been moving forward on, and we're eager to hear more about it. Then we're going to hear from Caltrans, which has supplied the committee with a significant amount of information regarding its use of performance measurement. And Caltrans is deeply committed to performance measurement. They clearly use data and measurement in virtually all decision making. So I want to thank them for their prompt and thorough response to the requests that we made of them last year, and I look forward to their testimony. Finally, we're going to hear from the Legislative Analyst Office, which will provide their perspective on Caltrans' performance and their performance measurement program. And I'm hoping that the LAO can also make comments as to whether they feel that Caltrans' program adds value to the public and the legislature, and how the legislature can better use this information as we authorize the department's annual budget. And again, this is the furthest thing from a partisan issue that we're going to see in budget. This is something where, how you spend the money, whether you're dealing with taxes or revenues or spending. That's all a second issue. The question of efficiency in government is something that we are all 100% committed to, and that's what this performance-based budgeting discussion is about. So first, let's hear from Michael Cohen regarding the governor's executive order. So, Michael, if you'd come up and give us a little briefing on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, wait, what was it? Before I start, I should offer, if the Vice Chair has any opening comments you'd like to make. I apologize, Michael.
Hardly any. I just say this is indeed bipartisan cooperation. Performance-based makes a lot of sense. The bill was bipartisan support. I would only suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we also consider marrying, in some cases, zero-based budgeting, kind of on a rotational basis to look at zero-based budgeting and apply it to certain agencies. I'd love to start with corrections. and do a little zero-based budgeting too, so we can get deep inquiry into the entirety of a budget, into the very depths, just on some of the agencies select. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Michael Cohen with the Department of Finance. Perfect introduction from Mr. Nielsen in that one of the things that the administration is very committed to is using a variety of tools to make our budget better and more effective. Zero-based budgeting is one of those, as I'll talk about. The last time I was before the subcommittee, we were discussing SB 14, which at the time, you'll recall, the administration raised a number of concerns with it that we highlighted in our testimony, and then the governor, when he vetoed the bill. The main concern was kind of going down the path of a one-size-fits-all approach to performance budgeting, or whatever term of art you like to use to encompass the notion of being concerned about success in government and achieving the goals that are desired. So instead, in the veto of SB 14, the governor said he would issue an executive order, which he did in December. And that executive order, which I'll walk you through, basically requires the Department of Finance to issue a report on, well, what's the path, what's the plan for making our budget process more effective and more focused on success and performance and so forth. The governor gave us 90 days, which puts us into early March. So as I sit here at the beginning of February, I think I can give you some details, but I hope that you'll give me a little bit of freedom in not having all the answers, in that we haven't finalized our report. We certainly can come back and talk to you in more detail once that's released. And even I can say right now, a month from now, I'm not going to have all the answers, nor will the department, nor will the administration. This is a process that is going to take time, and we're not going to solve every budgeting problem in the state overnight, but we do want to do a much better job at highlighting those problems that we know are there and what's the path for solving them. And also, one of the things we don't do a very good job at, highlighting those areas where we are doing a good job, and try to extend that knowledge from one program or one department more statewide. So I think the problems with the current budgeting system are fairly well known and well documented, but in general, we tend to focus a lot of time on incremental changes. We take a base budget, and then, as you know, we submit to you budget change proposals, which ask you to either add money or subtract money from an individual department. And on a year-to-year basis, in many cases, it makes a lot of sense that if you're happy with it, with what a department's doing, and they have a major new responsibility that costs money, you want to add resources to address that responsibility. However, over time, it's very easy in an incremental budgeting system to sort of lose track of what are the goals and the mission of a particular program or department. And so the executive order really is designed to try to, rather than on an ad hoc basis, more institutionalize an effort to focus on what are we trying to achieve and how can we achieve it better. But we don't think that every problem will sort of come with the same solutions. So the executive order lays out a variety of tools that are at the administration and the legislature's disposal to try to solve problems. So zero-based budgeting is one we highlight. Performance outcome measures, another one. Program reviews, program audits. All of these types of tools are available to us depending on what the problem is that we're trying to solve. In some cases, such as Caltrans, as you'll discuss, there is a lot of data already collected, performance measures, and so that can be a good way to sort of evaluate how the department's doing. In other cases, it's much harder to either, one, know what the right data is to evaluate is a department sort of being as effective as possible, and two, do we actually have access to that data, or would it cost huge amounts of money to start collecting it, or is it at the end of the day impossible to collect? And so that's really one thing we're trying to avoid, is sending every program and every department off to develop 50 or 100 performance measures, go out and collect 150 or 200 new sets of data, and spend all of our time collecting data rather than identifying specific problems and using the right tool to come up with solutions. To highlight the specifics of the executive order, the governor has required the Department of Finance to really address 5 things in the report that we're working on. First is a strategy to incorporate these program evaluation methods into the budget process on selected activities and programs. And so really what we're envisioning is starting with some selected programs and making sure that we're learning from our experiences. So as you read through the governor's budget summary, as well as you sit in your subcommittees and hear different proposals, you'll see that there are already a number of processes underway to kind of kick us off and focus more on performance and achieving goals. So just to highlight a few of those examples, in December, the Department of Mental Health released a report that was really coming out of the changes going on in the department that had taken place over the last number of years, as well as some severe budget problems. And so we brought in some experts and spent several months kind of taking a hard look at all of their different activities and kind of building their budget up from the ground up. And you'll hear more about that in subcommittee. Additional new proposals to take, for example, the Department of General Services and the Technology Agency. There, we're sort of mid-process in identifying that we want to lower the rates that those departments charge other departments. We want to become more efficient and more effective, but we still owe you the details on doing that. But by taking a look at those departments that provide services to the rest of state government, if we can provide services at a lower cost, departments have more resources to spend on delivering program services rather than paying for various state operations things, procurement costs, and so forth. In corrections, we've identified that we're going to zero base the parole functions within the department. You'll hear more about Caltrans's activities. The second main piece of the report is ways to increase transparency about all of these program goals and outcomes. And really this gets to the comment I made earlier that we're not great at highlighting those areas where we already do collect lots of performance data. So I think this hearing to talk about Caltrans as an example is a good way to highlight that we do have a lot of information on data and measurement, but we don't always make it easily accessible. And when one department learns how to do it well, we're not always great about making sure that expertise is shared with the rest of state government. Third, a process for collaborating with the legislature, particularly in establishing program goals and measuring program outcomes. Well, I think being here today is one step in that, and it's certainly not an easy process. And it's not a simple, quick process. It's going to take us much time, but we sort of have to start that collaboration and that conversation at some point, and we really appreciate this opportunity to begin that conversation. Fourth, a structure to work with local governments to develop accountability and performance metrics for programs that they run on behalf of the state. The state of California, in many, many cases, is basically a pass-through entity where we're controlling the dollars, but local governments are running our programs. Realignment passed last year. It was an expansion of that. But even pre-realignment, counties in particular are kind of the administrative arm of the state in running lots of our programs, and it's very different to evaluate the performance and effectiveness of the Department of Corrections that we control versus a program that we've asked counties to administer on our behalf. And then fifth and finally, an implementation timeline. And as I mentioned, we are beginning to implement these things that we're talking about already in the release of the governor's budget, but what I expect the report to lay out is a more formalized timeline for how do we figure out what are good candidates and what sort of a schedule over the next several years. And so with that, let me stop and just say, again, we recognize that working with the legislature is a critical component to making this an effective change in our budget process, and I look forward to doing that with this subcommittee in particular.
Great. Thank you very much, and we really appreciate you making that your center bullet, number 3, and about working with us on developing that. And I know we're all eager to do that, both in this sub 6, but also in our individual subcommittees, so that we're ultimately, after we get through this, we'll have, that will be part of the discussion in subcommittee each time is not just the BCPs, but it's going to be a question of what are the impacts and how are we doing on those impacts, and it's going to be part of the discussion with Caltrans to talk about how we go about and measure that. One question, and then I'm going to ask just a quick question, and then kind of go around the horn for folks. And like in previous budget committees, I'd love for people to just have 1 or 2 issue questions and go back to the queue, and that way we can make it more of a discussion rather than 6 individual conversations. One thing came to mind is fiscal. And this was part of the SB 14. One part that I liked was that, and I'm hoping that this will be part of your bullet 5 in terms of implementation timeline. But in order to make performance budgeting really integrated into the administration, I would think that it would also have to be integrated into the retraining that's going on with fiscal over the next several years. How do you see that happening? Do you see that happening? Is that part of the implementation plan?
Absolutely. That you'll be getting more details on the specific direction on fiscal in the coming weeks. But one of the real struggles with sort of evaluating all of our programs is a lack of easily accessible data, and that's one thing that fiscal will tremendously help with. And so it would be silly of us to design a new budgeting system and exclude kind of the opportunity to take a fresh look and integrate both what we're doing here with the executive order and our new budgeting system. So absolutely, we anticipate kind of making the best use of fiscal's new tools going forward.
Great. Mr. Nielsen.
Mr. Cohen, I compliment you in the direction that we're sharing with you. What will be the means? I'm always so fastidious about process. So as finance employs performance-based, just you, not us, but you employ it, you find this and that and the other thing. Will you in the subcommittees or the full committee present your thoughts based on your performance review, and we see that this could be changed and bring suggestions to it? Would you be doing it independently to the chair and the vice chair, or to the members of the committee, the chairs of the subcommittees? What will be the means that you would apply, in other words, your performance-based review?
Sure. So I don't have, that's one of the things I don't have a specific answer for you today, but I certainly would envision kind of a collaborative process where we identify what projects we think make sense, what priorities are in terms of this program struggling and could use additional attention, and bring that to the legislature as sort of okay, here's this year's schedule, and then there would be the traditional back and forth between the legislature and the administration in terms of priorities. Things often change, so I would imagine whatever schedule would be fluid. That if there was a department that needed more immediate attention than something else, that it would be kind of a constantly updated priority list and schedule. But there would be that kind of back and forth with the legislature, that if there was something that the legislature felt very strongly about that needed attention, that we could adjust things.
Well, surely the situation is fluid, but I would suggest formality to rein in the fluidity. In other words, I would suggest that our staff, or I'll work with the chairman on that, but there be some kind of regular meetings, not every week or such as that, but when certain information comes to, but we'll have certain moments where we do sit down and say, well, we've been performance reviewing this and this and this, and here's a list of 5 things we've reviewed that rise to the top. I would suggest we together come up with some formality of scheduled meetings to discuss this issue, okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
Ms. Buchanan, followed by Ms. Harkey.
I just want to start out by saying that I think we all need to understand there's a difference between performance-based budgeting and zero-based budgeting. I've always viewed performance-based budgeting as a process that helps our managers, directors, agency heads take a look at, what they're doing, what the cost is, all of that, to determine how effective programs are. And if you've got, 2 programs, A and B, and you're getting better results from A than B or whatever, to take a look at that and decide how you want to allocate your resources. Zero-based budgeting is sort of a building up from the bottom up. And so I've always, perceived this as being able to get more information from the departments, agencies on what their priorities are, how they're measuring their outcomes, how they're asking us to allocate their money. But when it comes to the legislature, we get more in the governor. We're doing more of a zero base because we're talking about, what we can afford based on our priorities for all the agencies. So I just wanted to clarify that I think those are 2 different processes. But I want to just sort of share with you what's been a frustration for me in the 2 years I've chaired budget subcommittees, and that's the fact that I've never seen a budget. All I get are BCPs, budget change proposals, and I really have no way of evaluating them, because I get from you, the Department of Finance, a budget change proposal that says, okay, the federal government's asking us to do these 5 more things, so we need 2 more people or whatever, but I have no way of knowing, is the workload the same? Is the workload higher? Is the workload less? Do we really need the people? How do we evaluate it? And I've often thought, if I write twice as many bills, I don't get twice as many people. And that's not to say that we don't want to give each department, division, whatever, agency, the number of employees they need to do the job and deliver quality service. But I think there's more to the process than just performance-based budgeting and where we go. It's in terms of, what the information you give us and what we have to actually evaluate budgets, because I think it would be much more meaningful for me as a legislator if I could actually have the big picture in addition to the little changes that we're asked to do.
If I could just make a couple comments. I completely agree with you on your first point about the terminology, and one of the things I've discovered is even a term like performance-based budgeting, where you just described it one way, we probably would get close to one different interpretation of what it means for each of us sitting here. And then zero-based budgeting is something different, and you wouldn't want to zero-based budget every single program or every single department every single year. You would just sort of be spending all of your time building things from the ground up and never spend any time sort of focusing on making improvements and making change. So I think Assemblymember Nielsen made the comment about sort of on a rotating basis on zero-based budgeting and select programs, which makes a lot of sense. In terms of the second comment about the increment, I mean, we do provide a complete budget to you for every department, but clearly the state's current budget process focuses very heavily on the incremental changes, and that in most years we're only talking about a relatively small piece of things. And so I think all of this with the executive order and performance budget and all that hopefully is requiring everyone to step back and remind themselves, well, what is the department trying to accomplish? What's its goal? And how do we better achieve that goal? And it does require stepping back. And
I agree. And having every single line item in a budget is not where we want to go. But having some kind of overview in terms of, what's the workload? How's that change? How many more people or fewer people are we serving? What are we doing? And what are, a high level of exactly what's happening, I think would be for me, it would be very meaningful. And I think for the public at large to truly understand, what the underlying programs are we're trying to deliver and what's happened with them. So, but thank you.
Great. Ms. Harkey, followed by Ms. Mitchell.
I can't agree more with Ms. Buchanan because I've sat at these hearings and I don't know what I'm looking at. I have no idea what I'm looking at. I just know that somebody wants more people and they need this much more money. And because we did a study 5 years ago that shows that this is going to be needed, we just need to give it now, and we get a little pie chart. It's very, very difficult to approve something with no information. And so I think we need to get, at least for those who choose to look at it, the larger picture of where we're going before we keep getting these BCPs. But you brought something up that there's differing definitions of performance-based budgeting. So maybe the first thing that this committee needs to do is define what is exactly we're talking about. Because if, in fact, Ms. Buchanan's definition can be altered, that's where we're going to get the pushback on anything we try to do. So I think we need to establish what the definition is, and everybody live by that definition and move forward. Because my question was, who's going to be pushing back? And now I think I'm seeing, just through merely the conversation up here, that we could have quite a differing opinion as to what we're looking for. And we don't need any more of that. We need some clarity. So I would appreciate a definition. And anyway, I think I'll leave it at that. I've got some other little issues, but I'll leave it at that.
I can put you to the back of the queue if you want to add on. Ms. Mitchell, followed by Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I don't think there's anything that stops us today as subcommittee chairs from asking departments for clarity and asking that they submit budgets as we are pondering and making decisions around budget change proposals today. So I don't know that as subcommittee chairs we have to wait for a fully fleshed out well, you can ask for it, Ms. Harkey. I have. The point is, we're empowered today, whether this new budget management, program management system is fleshed out or not, to hold departments accountable to our standard. However you run your subcommittee, if you have some questions about budget change proposals and you need some clarification, I believe, Mr. Chair, please correct me if I'm wrong, that it would be expected of us as subcommittee chairs to ask for that clarification today. We need, as legislators, to be comfortable with the decisions that we're making and have to hold departments accountable and have the authority and power to deny their budget change requests, to not agendize them, all those kinds of things. So I don't want us to feel like we have to wait for this process to be fully fleshed out and defined and clear before we step up and hold departments accountable today, particularly when we look at the kinds of cuts that are happening on the program side. I mean, it's a real balancing act, I think, that we as budget committee members have to engage in. I wanted to just piggyback on Mr. Nielsen's comments. From what I've read about performance measures that other states have already engaged in through NCSL, and they've done some great kind of analysis looking at this process that other states have engaged in. My question really goes back to process and making sure that the legislature and the legislative oversight is really ingrained in the process that is included in the executive order, whose language is really broad and open to interpretation, but really looking at the process and how we operationalize this transition, and really hoping that we learn from the experiences of other states and how we go about it, but making sure that we are empowered to be engaged in that process on an ongoing basis.
One of the nice things that we're, hopefully this year's process is more deliberative than we've had in past years, because we're not dealing with a March cash crunch. We're not dealing with, every year in my tenure we've had budget decisions in December or March, and even though we have the authority to do the accountability, we've been so under the gun we haven't been able to exercise it as much as we may have wanted to. So it's my hope that both by moving this performance-based budgeting concept forward and working with the departments, but also in the subcommittees, as Ms. Mitchell pointed out, taking the time to hold them accountable, even with the tools that we have, that just the fact that we're going to be, have a more regular schedule this year will allow us to do that. Mr. Gordon, followed by myself, followed by Ms. Harkey.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that as it relates to Budget Subcommittee number 3, it is, I've been working with staff, it is our intention to have, at the initial set of hearings, not focus in on the BCPs, but focus in on the big picture, and try to ascertain from the various departments that are under our purview, what are some of the big issues? What are they working on? What are they focusing on? And I think that clearly we have that capacity. We can do that. And I also think that it provides us with a baseline for beginning to understand how we also then flesh out the performance-based budgeting system in working with the administration. I look at this performance-based budgeting and think very much that it is a very much an iterative process. It develops over time. I think that in many ways, as we wade into these waters, we probably start with stuff that's pretty simple, and over time we develop expertise and skill and can get better at the process and better at understanding, and then we're turned out. So we'll start now. I'm in my second year. I'll start right now. And I do think that it is a process. It's not something that's an end goal. I also do think that it is helpful to understand, as was said earlier, that zero-based budgeting is a different process, but there are ways to link them and to have them work together, and that's something that also I think develops over time. I know my own experience. We're in a county government where we put in performance-based budgeting. I don't think we really use performance-based budgeting to make any kind of budget decisions until about year 10. It took time to understand how all these things come together. And I understand we're in a world of term limits, but I think we have to work at that and work with those who will follow us to build kind of a tradition and a way of doing business that becomes more of our norm, and so that we set an institutional attitude and approach for the longer term. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good comments all around for everyone. Just a couple last little things. I was curious about the you mentioned zero-based budgeting with the parole function, and I was curious what you were thinking on that, or if that's been fleshed out at this point.
Not entirely, but I think zero-based budgeting is particularly a helpful tool when kind of the world is changing that affects the department. So clearly the Department of Corrections has had major changes in recent years, AB 109 last year and so forth. So the way I think about it is, okay, things have changed. The Department of Corrections was really budgeted in an era of increasing population and growth, and you take the opportunity to step back and say, okay, there have been lots of changes. Is this the right staffing model? Does the approach still make sense? But the details of that for parole specifically will come later.
Okay. I think Ms. Harkey had a comment, and then
Just,
we'll move
just,
to Caltrans.
just one more thing. I would like to at least start with this committee with the definition. And I don't care whose definition, but I would like to be sure that we establish one before we meet again, that there's a definition of what we're starting with anyway. And when we look at performance-based budgeting, so we don't have any confusion. And I do think it's very, very important that we at least get a pilot program started, because next year 50% of our house will be brand new. I'm in my 4th year. I'll be rolling out. We don't have 10 years to implement. And these priorities that we set, once we start digging out of our financial hole, we'll just go back, way back here again, and then we'll be stuck 10 years from now trying to figure out what we did. So I know I agree with Ms. Buchanan. Our first 2 years, we really couldn't get the data, and we had 5 budgets in 2 years. So we were constantly just churning, and we were adding people and whatnot, and did not have background information and couldn't really get the access to it because we were on the next committee and the next budget and the next overnight. So I think, it was very different a couple years ago than it is right now, and so I'd just like to see we have a definition. If if the chair wants to define it, so that we start there, and then if we want to change it somewhere down the line, but I think we need to know exactly where we're going with it. Thank you.
And the next part of our hearing with Caltrans, I think our goal as a committee is to try to drill down on exactly what are the metrics and questions, and so we can start doing it in real time instead of the sort of theoretical big picture. We're going to pick an agency and really focus. Ms. Buchanan.
I just have to clarify. I know we can ask for data. I have asked for data. Sometimes getting it is not very easy. Sometimes you ask for it and you don't get what you ask for. But I think to
All the departments will get it for you.
Well, good luck. And it's not that everyone's not, and I'm not saying people aren't working hard or aren't providing great service or anything else, but I'd like to see us get to a point where I didn't have to make a special request, but we had information, provided in a more meaningful way starting out, and then if we had specific questions, we could ask that during the meetings, because it's very difficult if you want to try and tackle all the different departments or agencies or whatever to do that. And so, yes, we can ask, yes, we're going to be doing that in my sub just like the others, but I'd like to see us get to a point where the information you provide us, and I don't care, I'm not saying it has to be, I know there's limitations and everything else, but it's just sort of a little bit more meaningful. I want a high-level summary. I don't want to get into the weeds and everything. A little bit more meaningful up front, because I think it would give us just a little bit better perspective as we go in to discuss the items or the BCPs in more detail.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Buchanan. And I think that's a good segue as we now move into the next phase. I want to thank Mr. Cohen for talking to us about the executive order and for your commitment to work with us on this important issue, and we appreciate what you do. Thank you. So now let's shift to Caltrans, and let's see if we can develop an outline of performance measures for Caltrans. Caltrans was chosen as our first department for us as a subcommittee to look at for a reason. It already had pages of data to draw on to create performance measures. My idea is to begin the process of using existing performance data to provide context to department budgets in our hearings. It isn't pure performance-based budgeting, as we're discussing, but it's a step in that direction. Most importantly, however, this approach has minimal costs and allows us to get started moving in the direction. There are 161 state departments, and what I hope we do today is sketch out a preliminary framework that we can use to develop thoughtful and effective performance measures for all of them over time. This is our goal, and meeting it will dramatically improve our budget process by linking it more concretely to challenges we see in our districts. I remember when I was sub-chair of Subcommittee 5, which at that time was the Transportation Committee. My district, the San Fernando Valley, is defined by constant freeway traffic. It's unfortunately it's something we excel in, is traffic. and it's always been one of my constituents' biggest concerns. And I really want to explore how we could position the state to capture more federal funds for transportation to really make an impact for my community and others. But the budget process quickly sent our committee discussions into a litany of BCPs. So starting our budget process with performance data could set the table for a good budget discussion. For example, Caltrans could provide data on traffic levels as one of its performance measures. If we had that information, we could start our deliberations by defining the problem, traffic, before we started trying to weigh the merits of budget proposals that were the solution. If we had 2 to 4 pieces of information regarding the biggest problems or deliverables, it would be the logical introduction to a discussion of the department's goals, objectives, and budget issues. By identifying some performance measures for Caltrans today, we can reference them as a justification for our budget solutions. From that point onward, the performance measures would be part of the budget submission. Over time, future members of the legislature could redefine these measures or make them more complex when data or perhaps funding is available. Now, I know that members have different ideas about how performance budgeting should work. We've already had some discussion about that already. But I really hope we can all express our ideas today and try to drive towards some consensus or vision for how we can move forward. Without a common vision, we could spin our wheels trying to move forward. But my goal today is to articulate a concept of what good measurement system would look like so I can direct the staff to create a template for Caltrans for us to consider at future hearings. So I don't expect us to have that template coming out of this hearing. We'll probably end up by directing staff to do it, but I think it'll be a little unusual hearing in that it's really going to be sort of a discussion and trying to get our hands around that. I also want to announce that my office has also commissioned a group of graduate students at UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy to research best practices for performance measures in other states. 43 other states have some type of performance-based budgeting currently in place, and we'll have a report later this spring from this group to further help us focus our efforts. Combined with the discussions we have today, we can build a template approach and a work plan to make performance-based budgeting a reality in California over the next few years. Moving forward today, Caltrans and LAO will now make their presentations, and we'll hold all questions for both Caltrans and LAO until after your presentations are done. So without anything further, if you would introduce yourself and begin.
Well, Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for this very timely hearing. I'm Martin Tuttle. I'm the Deputy Director for Planning Modal Programs at Caltrans. I'm joined by Coco Briceño, who heads up our strategic planning efforts, and it's a continuous process at Caltrans to continue to get better, and she's here to ask or be available on specific performance measures details. I want to say that on behalf of our acting director, Malcolm Doherty, and our entire staff, we welcome this opportunity. Caltrans is one of the world's premier project delivery organizations, and we do have the 55 performance measures. You got the big binder. Your staffs have those. We did not. Well, Coco brought her binder with her. I didn't.
Carry it with me.
I did provide a short summary of the key points I wanted to make today. Caltrans is at a high water mark in terms of projects under contract, $11 billion in terms of projects that are underway under contract currently today. It is an all-time high for us. So as you mentioned, the state's economic problems, for us it's been a little different because we've had the Recovery Act, we've had, thanks to you and the voters, Proposition 1B, we've had an infusion of one-time money. And we have had a lot of success, and you know, from a department perspective, we can't take all the credit because, as you know, transportation projects involve local money, oftentimes private sector money, federal money, and it also involves the cooperation and a partnership with the counties, the regional sales tax county, or the counties that have a sales tax. It involves partnership with the legislature, labor, the contractors. You cannot move a project forward unless you have that partnership. But I want to say that that partnership is part of our culture, just as performance measures and data are part of our culture. Maybe it's the engineering aspect of the department, but we are driven by data and performance measures. And when they fall short, then our staff rises to the occasion to address those shortfalls that have been identified by performance measures. So we've had a lot of success. particularly recently. And again, it's just not to the department's credit, but it's to that transportation community's credit that we work well together and we deliver great projects. I mentioned that we have $11 billion under contract. That's over 700 projects. We've awarded 90% of the Recovery Act money, and you'll see in a later slide the impact of that. And some of these projects are known around the world. We're ready to introduce in early 2013 a new world icon with the Bay Bridge that will get global attention, and it is a project that we're very proud of, and again, with the partnership of many agencies. We're partnering with the private sector. There's a project in Southern California, the long-standing, over 100-year gap on railroads where trains actually had to stop to cross the tracks. That's at Colton Crossing. We partnered with the railroads to actually have that project under construction, and it's a huge source of pride. One other thing that we're trying to do is to break out of our silos so that it's just not highways, it's rail, which we oversee the intercity services. It's not transit in a silo, but we're all really working together in a multimodal fashion. So in Southern California and Orange County, I have a photo of one of our changeable message signs where we're advertising that you could beat the time into Orange County to downtown Los Angeles by train. So when the train is faster than the freeway, on the sign it alerts you to do that the next exit provides a train opportunity. And we've had success on that, and you'll see that, I think, spread throughout the Los Angeles basin and around the state. Our maintenance workers, the folks who are out there making sure that the roads are clean and safe, have done an incredible job. You wouldn't know it by this winter, but last winter in the Sierras we had 800 inches of snow. Our maintenance workers were able to keep those interstates open. That made a good benefit from an economic standpoint in terms of goods moving in and out of our state, people being able to move from one region to another, and that was a tremendous effort. And oftentimes, I think we forget about those who are actually on the ground keeping that working. Last year we had 3 fatalities, and that really shook our organization, where 3 of our maintenance workers were killed. We responded to that, and we'll have a performance measure on that later, but in response to that, we used our changeable message signs to alert motorists to watch out for our workers. We had a safety stand down where we required all of our department to reinforce the notion that safety is our number one priority. And again, that is a performance measure. I mentioned the notion of being multimodal. We are working with communities along our 3 intercity routes, the Sacramento to San Jose, the San Joaquin corridor, and then the Pacific Surfliner in Southern California, which connects San Luis Obispo, Los Angeles to San Diego. Those are state-funded routes, and all 3 of them had record ridership last year. So obviously we have a performance measure on rail ridership and are addressing the bottlenecks, the issue of on-time performance, to continue to build the ridership so that people can move quickly around the state. The one slide that kind of puts the big picture in your earlier discussion with Mr. Cohen about the big picture. This slide shows that the high water mark in terms of funding, and it is a credit to the local sales tax, gets applied to the state highway system. It's a credit to the Recovery Act. It's a credit to Prop 1B. But we are headed on a funding cliff. We are on a downward spot as we move these projects out. The availability of funds for transportation projects is something we want to alert. So we are responding to this this cliff in terms of our staffing, really beginning to attrit and get smaller, and that is a significant big picture item for the department. Mr. Cohen just talked about the executive order, and our acting director has moved us to do a program review so that we can get a jump on anticipated issues for the department. We have brought our district director from our San Diego office, Lori Berman, up to Sacramento to spend two months with us on a program review. It is a major effort where we're internally talking to our 12 districts about ways that we could be more efficient. We've assembled a group of external partners to work with us and ask them questions about what Caltrans could do to be more efficient. Simple ways in terms of avoiding duplication in approvals so that one engineer can sign off on a project without having it to move, say, to headquarters and have that approved, so we can streamline our process. And also the fundamental issue, are there things that we do at Caltrans that might be better done at the local level? So we are moving quickly on this program review, so I think this discussion today is very timely in terms of providing input on that, but we're ready to have a draft report in early March on that program review. Now, getting into the subject of performance measures, again, the department has a culture of being data-driven, performance-based driven. In my short time at Caltrans, in 2.5 years, we've had 4 directors. But the mission has not changed. The notion of providing mobility across California and the various goals that we have not changed. In fact, new employees get a little card with those on it. They put it next to their ID so that there's no question about what the mission and goals of the department are. And then our performance measures, this overwhelming number of 55, fit in within those goals. But it is part of this culture. And again, the performance measures that we have seen have really motivated behavior. So if there is a shortfall on one, that it really is a rallying call for staff to address it. The goals of our department with this overriding mission of providing mobility for Californians, and again, it's just not on freeways but other modes. Our goals are safety, mobility, delivery of projects, stewardships in terms of the preserving and enhancing the resources of the state, and service. This customer service is a major goal. So going down, I guess, from the big picture to the specific, we did want to call out some of the performance measures that really drive the culture and behavior at the department. Traveler safety, obviously, for motorists and is a key issue, and you can see that the trend line is going down. The issue of worker safety is internally a major issue, and as I mentioned last year, we did have the 3 fatalities. Our goal is 0 each year, and we think we are fortunately, so far in this year, we have not had one. The mobility goal in terms of statewide hours of traffic delay, we measure that. It is probably not a perfect measure because it is statewide. You can see the recent drop. Obviously, we've added some capacity projects, but the issue of the drop relates more to the economy and fewer people who are having to go to work. And you know that on your commute, that you have less congestion than you had a few years ago, is really directly related to the recession and people who are not headed to work. It's sort of that pajama factor. If you see people at schools and so on, you see men in their mid-40s who are still wearing their pajamas at 8 o'clock in the morning. They're out of work and are not part of the congestion. But we are moving on this particular aspect to more of a corridor basis so that we can focus on the performance of a corridor and ways to improve that. Another key issue for us as a premier project delivery organization is the percentage of projects that are timely ready to go to construction. You can see our goal is 100%. We were at 97% in this last year. That translates to successfully moving forward on 342 out of 346 projects, which is a tremendous performance. Our district directors have a contract for delivery that lists these projects. So if there is a project that is in danger and slipping for, say, a right-of-way issue or an environmental hurdle, we draw attention to that and bring our partners in and try to move that project through. So, currently to have 342 out of 346 is a really a huge source of pride for the department. Maintenance, the stewardship goal in terms of maintaining what we have. We do measure that. It's a complex measurement that includes litter, striping, guardrail, the motorist experience, which would include potholes on a section of road. that one, I need to get more data on it and better understand that. But from a maintenance perspective, those on the ground do use that as a measuring stick. So if it falls below the targeted threshold, more resources, more attention is delivered to that stretch of road. And then lastly, I wanted to reemphasize that strategic planning, performance measurements, and management is a continuous effort for this department. We continue to want to get better. We have a lot of forces that are pushing us, our local partners, the constituents, your constituents, who want to see projects get delivered. There's a lot of pressure on Caltrans to perform better. We are a transparent organization. Those 55 performance measures are reported quarterly to agency. They're on our website. If there's ways that we can get better, the department is certainly ready to embrace that. So again, very timely hearing. We're in the middle of the program review. Any suggestions you have that we could feed into that and come back to you, we would be happy to do that. So.
Maybe just one thing that I'll add that regarding the 55 performance measures is when we first established those 55 performance measures, we didn't do it in isolation with just our own department. We worked very closely with our external partners and actually beyond just our transportation partners, but some of the partners in just the economic community as an example, like the California Business Roundtable as an example. So just to give you a little context of where they all came from.
Great, thank you. I mean, before we do questions, I could ask you all to stay up here on the dais, and I'll have Ms. Peters come up as well, and then give us a little overview from the LAO perspective, and then we'll have a discussion with. I mean, we'll conduct it like a hearing, but I want it to feel more like a discussion and about the overall issue. And Ms. Mitchell will have the first question when we start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Jessica Peters with the Analyst's Office. We have a handout for you today that I believe has been passed out, and I'll just walk you through what's in the handout. On page 1, we have some background information for you on performance-based budgeting. In your discussion already with Mr. Cohen, I think some of these issues have come up. We do provide sort of a broad definition of performance-based budgeting that perhaps might be helpful for you in your starting point as you develop how the legislature wants to define performance-based budgeting as you work through this process. We would point out that it differs from your traditional budget approach in that you're focusing on outputs and performance rather than inputs and staffing decisions and things like that and process. California has undertaken a pilot program to do performance-based budgeting in the past. In the 1990s, four different departments were pilot programmed for performance-based budgeting. The state ultimately did not fundamentally change the way that it budgets for these departments based on the pilot. But as many of you know, members, because you've worked on this at the local level, local governments as well as other states have implemented performance-based budgeting with various degrees of success. Some of the benefits to using performance-based budgeting include that provides an effective way for the legislature to get an overall picture of the performance of a department relatively quickly and to help put things into context when you are evaluating some of the more incremental changes to a budget that are being proposed. It can provide measurable outcomes for programs that directly relate to specific policy goals that you would establish, and so you can see how some of the goals that you have are actually, being implemented and how well the departments are performing to meet those goals. And it can facilitate improved outcomes by linking program funding to the performance of the program itself. On page 2 of the handout, we have some keys to successful performance-based budgeting. Again, some of these were mentioned by Mr. Cohen already. The first one being there needs to be a strong cooperation and agreement between the legislature and the administration. This is the conversation you guys have already started today, talking about what would be the process for working between the legislature and the administration on determining policy goals and other things in process. The focus should be on a department's missions and goals and outcomes, not focusing on inputs and process. The focus should be on performance measures that are relevant and provide accurate and verifiable results. and having a willingness to accept a longer-term view of the implementation and results. I believe, as Mr. Gordon indicated, can take many years to actually work through the process of developing performance-based budgeting and using it in a more detailed level each year as that process is developed. On page 3 of the handout, I have some overview information for you on Caltrans. You have information that was provided by the department itself as well as in your staff report. So I just want to point out to you that the pie chart on this page, as you can see, the largest piece of the pie here, the largest piece of the Caltrans budget is related to highway projects and staffing for highway projects, either in capital outlay support or legal and other functions at the department that relate to those capital outlay improvements. The next largest piece of the budget is local assistance. These are funds, either state or federal funds, that pass through Caltrans to local agencies. Then we have maintenance and operations of the highway system. And the smallest piece of the budget relates to alternative modes, mass transportation, and aeronautics. We were asked to suggest 3 potential performance measures for Caltrans, and we list those on page 4 of the handout. The first one is the condition of the highway system. Now, a primary goal of Caltrans and part of their core part of their mission is to maintain the state's highways. The condition of bridges and pavement also can impact drivers. If people are driving on very rough roads with a lot of potholes, it's going to put a lot of extra wear and tear on their car. It can be, noisy and could even, in extreme cases, lead to accidents. And so having roads that are in good condition can impact drivers' perspective of and their experience of the transportation system. It can also have significant future cost implications to the state. Assets that are well maintained will last for a long time, whereas assets that are not being maintained can degrade very quickly and require costly repair and replacement. And so we think this is an important thing to measure, both in terms of drivers' experience and your sort of big picture policy outcomes, as well as it has significant cost implications to the state. The second measure that we would recommend would be to look at throughput on the state's highways. This will look at, within the highway system that you have, how many vehicles are able to travel safely and quickly. You can look at congestion as well as how effectively the system is being operated. We think this is important because it's a core part of Caltrans' mission to operate the state's highways and to relieve congestion where it occurs. It's also important to users of the highway system because nobody wants to be stuck in traffic. And it has important cost implications to the state as well because there's different strategies for relieving congestion, some of which are more cost effective than others. So those first 2 measures are fairly externally focused in terms of what is the experience of people who are out there driving on the state's highways. The third measure that we would suggest is more internally focused on the department, looking at their delivery of projects. On the previous page in that pie chart, you can see that over half of the department's workload relates to project delivery type of work for these large capital improvement projects. And so we think a measure looking at this would be appropriate for the department as it would capture the bulk of their workload and their budget. Caltrans already has several goals. Many of their 55 are related to looking at project delivery and making sure that they achieve their project delivery goals in a timely manner. This, again, has some cost implications to the state. You could measure how cost effective and in how timely of a manner Caltrans is delivering its projects. This can benefit users of the state's highway because if projects are completed on time, that provides the public access to the improvements sooner, whereas if they're delayed, then people will not have access to those projects in a timely manner. And lastly, projects that are delayed would have potential cost increases from the delays. So we think that's an important factor to measure. On the last page of the handout, we just have some issues for your consideration. We think that overall, as you think about this process of developing performance measures and how to tie these measures to the budget, a good starting point is to determine what are your performance goals. The 55 performance measures that Caltrans tracks are based on the department's strategic plan, where through the process that Coco alluded to earlier, the department has developed what it thinks are its top priorities and its goals. Now, some of your goals and priorities might be different than the ones that Caltrans has established. And so we think that having a thoughtful process up front to determine what are the goals and things that are most important to you is a good starting point. From there, we think that you should be very careful in terms of how you choose the data sources that you use to measure each specific performance measure. Data sources can contain biases, or they might not be verifiable. This could result in misleading information or gaming of the performance measures, or it could just result to the measure only capturing part of the program and showing that maybe it's doing very well and there's a problem that's not being measured, or showing that it's not doing well when maybe there's something that isn't being measured that is doing well. So we think it's important that the measures rely on data that can be verified and that can accurately capture the type of performance that's being measured. I wanted to give an example of this. One of Caltrans' 55 measures looks at the condition of pavement in the state, and their goal is to keep the level of distressed pavement below 30%, and their measure shows that they're meeting that goal. If you were to have a different measure with a different goal, but also looking at pavement condition, you could look at the goal of trying to keep pavement in the state in good condition, which would have more benefits to the state in terms of deferring future costs. And you could use a federal measure for this that would show that Caltrans has only 28% of the state's pavement is in good condition, showing, the two different measures looking at the same thing, one that shows they're meeting the goal and one that shows that there might be a significant problem. So it's very important how you choose the measure and the data source that you're going to look at to actually count that measure, and where you set that threshold for your goal. Because you can have two measures that tell very different story, even though they're looking at the same thing. The third issue that we would recommend that you consider, just to be aware that as you go through developing these goals and measuring the department's performance, it may become apparent that the department may need to change in response to the new goals that you may set for it. There might be changes to the department's priorities or even the department's organizational structure that will be needed to really facilitate and enable the department to best meet the goals that you would set for them. You may have noticed when we went through our 3 recommended measures that something that Caltrans talked a lot about we didn't mention: safety. It's not because we don't think safety is important. It's very important, as you know. But safety on the highways is an issue that's cross-cutting. It's not just Caltrans that has influence over safety outcomes on the highway. But this is an issue that cuts across CHP, who's responsible for enforcing laws and rules of the road and taking unsafe drivers off the road, DMV, who educates and licenses drivers and makes sure that they understand the rules of the road before they go out driving. And so you're going to encounter some issues like safety that are very important, but they're cross-cutting across multiple departments. And it's going to be more challenging, we think, to develop performance measures on a department-by-department basis when you have some really important cross-cutting issues. And so we would just put that on your radar to consider how you might want to deal with important issues that cut across multiple departments. And lastly, performance measures provide a good high-level way of looking at a department's performance, but it's not going to give you a full picture of what's happening in a department. The measures that we recommended would cover about 3/4 of Caltrans' budget, meaning that there would be no measure looking at the other quarter of the funds that they spend. And even the performance measures looking at those 3/4 that would be covered, it's not going to give you a full picture of what's happening. It might give you high-level information that would help you to be able to delve into issues more deeply and identify where there are issues you want to look into. But it's not going to be a substitute for the types of in-depth performance reviews and program reviews and other tools that you have in your toolkit of doing legislative oversight of these programs.
Thank you. And it's certainly no substitute for just good old-fashioned management, which is ultimately a responsibility of the agency, but where we have oversight of in terms of management. Before we get to Mr. Mitchell's question, I wanted to just ask Caltrans what you thought of those 3 performance measurements that were outlined by LAO.
Well, I think Ms. Peters' assessment is correct. On the latter one, on safety, when it impacts a Caltrans worker, then it does really become a major Caltrans issue. I said in my opening remarks that, we're part of a transportation community, and it includes the Highway Patrol, Office of Traffic Safety, and so on. So there are things that we are beyond our control, but with this partnership, I think our partners understand the significance of that. In terms of maintaining the state highway system, we could have a debate on different measurements for that. And I didn't mention in our program review effort is that we have reached out to a group in Wisconsin, the Smart State Transportation Initiative. It's a nonprofit that's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and U.S. Department of Transportation, and includes several former secretaries of transportation from other states. As a result of the budget constraints here, we have not been able to be engaged nationally as much as we'd like to. So we have brought them into this program review effort to look at what's being done in other states that we might be able to model here in California. But on maintenance, the current estimate to maintain our roads at our standard would be about $1 billion a year, and frankly, we're spending about $400 million a year. So we can debate the measurement, but it really comes down to a level of funding, and that's what we can afford at this point. I don't know, Coco, you want to add into it?
I think the one thing that I would like to add on the safety one, it's actually a very interesting one, and there's actually a really nice model. Because one of the things, maybe just to clarify, in the material that Caltrans, that we provided, this subcommittee, is really kind of what we call our organizational performance measures. So those are those that we kind of look at the enterprise level. But performance management is occurring throughout our organization. All of our functional areas are using a different layer, maybe a tier lower, of some of the performance data to sort of assess and manage and really just embark on performance management and assure that the programs are doing what they intend to do and meeting the goals and the objectives. So then we try to roll those up into something that gives that higher level picture. And that is probably the biggest challenge, is figuring out how you do that roll up and how do you represent those. And, we have 55 for now, but we actually recognize that there's things that we would do a little differently and change based on what we've learned from those. But that is a huge challenge. But the model, or the example that I was going to mention on the safety, is something that we've done more at the program level, working with our partners, that really reflects why fatalities are going down, and it's called the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. And this is a plan that was actually put together with local agencies, the law enforcement community and the medical community and others, where it actually really outlines some of the objectives at the program level with some clear measures, and then what were some of the data challenges that you need to address in order to ensure that you have the ability to monitor and to meet some of the challenges that were outlined in that Strategic Highway Safety Plan. So I just wanted to mention, just so that there's kind of an understanding of, there is that challenge of getting that bigger picture and then being able to also dive down into the detail.
Thank you. Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I've got a Black Caucus budget briefing that starts at 1, so I'm going to have to leave after this. I apologize. Couple questions, couple thoughts. First, of the LAO. I fully get and appreciate how looking at, thank you, Mr. Griffith, your 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet about measuring performance goals that involve multiple state departments can be challenging. But one thought that came to mind, particularly as we struggle with what role the legislature plays, and I want it to be a helpful role, not a too deep in the weeds nuisance role. But it seems to me that there could be a core set of performance-based measures that would be helpful to us, that would go literally across the board to every department. I don't know what they are. Again, clearly they couldn't be at the tier level that she just spoke about in terms of program-specific, but a core group of measures across the board, either around operating within budget, I don't know, that would be appropriate for the legislative branch to be able to use as an evaluation tool. Did you give any thought to that?
That's not something that we looked at in preparation for this hearing.
Yeah, but
I think that the more, just bear in mind that there's sort of a trade-off. The more broad that you get with the measure, sort of some of the less specificity and tie back to a particular program and issues that you might face in that program. The more targeted of a measure and the greater number of measures, you're going to get more detail that will be helpful and specific to a program, but it's not something that's translatable. So I think that there's just there's a balance there, and certainly there's probably some measures looking at just certain common themes among departments, or at least certain departments that you might want to have the same or similar measures.
I just think that since most of the time, given our function and role, we are operating at a 10,000-foot level. And when it comes to budgeting, and we're forced in a position, quite frankly, that we are this year, where we're really trying to make decisions between departments. Do we invest here or cut here? But to have real, like I said, core kind of performance expectations, that's just something to give some thought to. Again, as we struggle to figure out the most effective role we play in this process. And for the department, my quick question really is, I was reminded of kind of a rule in strategic planning and performance measurements, and looking at slides 10 and 11. And that really is, what gets measured gets done. And wondering, in your current 55 items that you're measuring, if there is a process by which, if there's some trigger by which you have to stop in real time and either add, delete, reevaluate what it is you're measuring based on kind of the realities of doing your work.
Sure. Over the course of when we started, we typically, the way we work this is we start our strategic planning effort, and as Marty pointed out, that's a continuous effort. And then through the course of the performance measurement reporting, there is a process within the department where we use the data. So we provide the information available to our executives and our decision makers to make sure that they're using it. And since we first started the performance measures, we have tweaked a few of them. I think we could do a better job of ensuring that we have a more formalized process. I think as we've learned, because one of the things that we're always looking at is how can we improve what we're currently doing and what we learned from what our current process is. And I think one of the things that we've looked at is we've kind of let it happen. If a performance measure happened, it was a discussion that happened between us and the programs, but we could put in place a little bit more formalized method of ensuring that happened. But over the course, when we first started these performance measures, they have been tweaked a little bit based on the assessment and the use of them.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, followed by Ms. Buchanan.
Ms. Peters, kind of a historical perspective. Through the 80s, the Wilson administration conducted a very massive executive branch-wide strategic planning exercise. I hope it was more than an exercise. I hope there's been some application. I guess that's my curious question. Are you aware that any of the strategic plans of that era, agency by agency, have ever been brought forward or respected or heeded or provided the basis for the next steps, like something where we're headed now? Could we build on the past of that very massive strategic planning that was done then?
I think I would have to defer to the Department of Finance to talk about how they have implemented plans of a prior administration. We do, in the first page of the handout, note for you in the 90s there was a sort of a pilot program to attempt performance-based budgeting for the Department of Consumer Affairs, Department of General Services, Parks and Rec, and Data Center. And through that, the results of that process was that those departments in the state did not fundamentally change the way those programs were budgeted.
I noticed that, and I don't know that comforted me. I thought I was probably more disturbed when I read that. What for if we don't change anything? And I do know that all things, or at least most things, do need to change. You were nodding, Mr. Tuttle. Did you?
Well, Mr. Nielsen, in our program review, what we did was we went back and looked at some of the past work that was done in terms of an organizational assessment on Caltrans. If we were going to do a program review, we wanted to benefit from past work. And in 1994, there was an exhaustive assessment of Caltrans done by SRI. And we went through, and there has been many of those recommendations were implemented, including regionalizing different services and so on. Rather than have each district doing project design, we have regionalized some of those efforts. But it was ironic, and one of the major recommendations in that back in 1994 was to consolidate the transportation agencies into one agency for the governor. And then the governor in 2012 has made that recommendation this year. It was included in that 94 proposal.
There were former ones, too, with the state police, CHP, and stuff. I mean, this has happened gradually over a period of time. Oh, that's encouraging, though. My concern is we don't need to always reinvent the wheel. We can build upon the old wheel or on the axle at least. And so that's encouraging.
And to follow up on that, we have a lot of pride in being what we consider the top project delivery organization in the world. And based on projects and the amount of funding for projects, we can make that case. But other states have done some pretty progressive things within their departments, and that's why we are engaging with the group from Wisconsin to look at good models organizationally and also as it relates to how they are organized for performance and see if we can apply some of that to California. And so we're meeting with them next week on that subject.
Thank you.
Ms. Buchanan, followed by Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. I just want to start out, because I do have some comments, by saying I do recognize that Caltrans has made some great strides over the years. I know if you talk to people locally, they feel that you're much more performance-oriented and than past decades. I just want to follow up, though, on something the LAO said, and that is that when I look at some of these performance measures, and we've kind of beating around a little bit the safety, there's no doubt that deaths on the highway are important, and we want to do all we can to avoid them. But whether it's due to the highway, whether it's because cars are safer, we have more airbags and other standards there. So I think it's important that we really kind of do all we can to drill down in terms of not just in that situation wouldn't be just highway deaths, but it would be serious accidents, other issues, and then hopefully we know, is it a certain type of road, or is it weather, does a certain type of barrier work better than another barrier, but we get down to where we can actually make decisions on where we allocate our resources and how we're allocating it, and what it costs us to allocate different resources. When I look at the maintenance, obviously we're going to have to decide on what our standard is, but the problem with what we're looking at here is it's a great, very level, high picture, but if we could take it down a notch, I think all of us would admit that we are in big trouble going forward in the future maintaining our roads, because all of you, I'm sure, would agree, as you alluded to, that we're not spending the dollars we need to keep our roads in the level of maintenance that the people in California, I think, want, and demand, because when you go throughout the state, whether you're in a very blue county or a red county, they're all passing the local sales tax measures for their roads because they want their roads to be in good shape. And so, when I take a look at this, it'd be nice if you had, how many miles of roads do we have, and what can we break that down into a couple different categories, 2, 3, 4, 5, in terms of what the condition is, and how do we add a dollar cost to that? Things that I've read say that if a dollar spent maintaining a road in the first 85% of its life cycle turns into $6 or $10 if you wait to the last 20%. And so, if we're falling behind and then prioritizing the most needy, we're then always spending the $6 to $10 instead of the $1, and it results in our having much higher maintenance costs than other states. So I think what we're doing here is a good start, but I also think trying to agree on objectives and trying to drill down underneath. So if I looked at this, I think everything was rosy.
Sure.
With the roads, and you and I both know, and you allude to it in the other chart in terms of the dollars and what happens when all these bond dollars drop off and the stimulus dollars we finished with those and everything, and how are we going to maintain our roads? And lastly, I've seen performance-based budgeting done with almost manual systems and also with sophisticated accounts payable, receivable, personnel kind of systems. But I do have to point out that whether it tied with a capital outlay support report that was done by the LAO or a report that was done later by the auditor, one of the things that Caltrans does have to focus on is having a better project management tracking system. Because, in terms of how do the estimates compare with ultimate costs, how are we in projects, are we delivering them within the original time frame, how does that change? We were dealing with, I believe it was a prison system that, 10 years into it, we still weren't implementing, and when I was chairing it, you were going to provide us reports, and then we decided, okay, well, if you're going to develop prison, we will delay that. But it's hard to know ultimately if we don't know what we're spending, and we found with some of that someone in one office might be working on 3 projects, but their time and costs weren't being allocated accordingly. It made it very difficult. So I think these are great measures, but I also think there have to be some internal changes. So when we're tying what it costs to what our objectives are, we have, meaningful data, because if not, someone from the public could pick it up and say, geez, Project A costs 10 times more than Project B, when the only reason was it was a error in how we were allocating. So, I think we're on the right track, and I do applaud everything you're doing, but I do think we have to drill down a little bit more and make sure that we're adequate, that we are accurately reflecting what we're doing in terms of tying costs to services.
Thank you. Mr. Gordon.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by saying that as I look at the graphs and the charts that Caltrans, you provided us, from my perspective, this is exactly the kind of information that I think leads to a very positive and productive discussion with the legislature and the budget committees. It doesn't say everything. That's okay. Mm-hmm. You look at this, it leads you to more questions. And I think that's what this process ought to be about. It's not getting to a definitive place, but it's trying to help us get better understanding. For example, look at the chart on that you had on funding of projects. And immediately want to talk about what are we going to do in the future? How are we going to fund things? That's not a simple question, and there's no simple answer. I look at safety, and as my colleague has alluded, there's a whole bunch of factors go into why we have safety, and they may cut across multiple departments. But that's a good question to discuss, because I think we all will share a goal of wanting the citizens and residents of California to be safe on our roads. So how do we get there? How do we do that the best? And what part of that does Caltrans play? What part of it does other agencies play? So from my perspective, this is exactly the kind of information, the kind of data, and the kind of measurements that lead us into really productive discussions and can then, in the long run, help inform how we allocate dollars. And it may well be that we make some decisions long term about how much money we put into maintenance as compared to how much money we put into new project development. It may lead us to talk about how much money we put into various safety measures as compared to something else. We are not unlimited in our resources, and so we have to be strategic and target what we do. I think this kind of information leads us exactly in that kind of direction, and it's one of the reasons that I'm a strong supporter of what I call performance-based budgeting, which we may well define better in the future. But as I wanted to thank you for the presentation, and this is the kind of thing that I find very helpful.
A lot of times people talk about, thank you. but the cost of performance measures. How much? And you've obviously have a lot of performance measurement that you've done in these 55 categories. How much has that costed you, if it's able to quantify it? I know there's different ways to quantify it because it's obviously spread across a lot of different projects, but has it been a burdensome process? Where do you get the funding for it? And does it actually cost a lot of extra money?
Well, let Coco address the staffing issue, but as Assemblyman Gordon just referenced, this is a major management tool, and our executives look at this data extensively. So, it's part of their job. But in terms of the particular cost to do this, Coco would be the one to address that.
Sure. Basically, for an organization the size of Caltrans, the way we're kind of organized is we have a staff of 4 folks that actually do all of the collection of all of the data and then do all of the preparing and kind of facilitating the strategic planning discussions and the performance management discussions. Mm-hmm. And then we also do a lot of federal reporting, and so that group of staff of 4 under my oversight is basically how we make sure that the reporting is done and that there's information for our executives and our decision makers to use. But I would just emphasize that it's part of our culture. So it is part of our daily business. It's what we do, the use of data in our decision making.
As my colleague was pointing out, that actually seems like a low number when you think about the size of the department. Are there particular things that the department is doing, duties, other things that are hard to measure or that you're not measuring that you wish that you could?
Well, I think one of the big issues that we face as managing department is succession planning. That the staff is aging and at some time will retire and move on, or be recruited to a regional agency to run that. If you look around the state, many of the self-help counties, those with the sales tax, are led by a former Caltrans employee. So succession planning is a fundamental issue for our future. And we are unable to really dive into that because of the budget constraints. So in terms of surveying our employees, in terms of job satisfaction, what type of tools do they need, and so on, is something that we do not fund right now. But, we'll talk about the issue of projects and moving those out. Succession planning for the long term of the department has to be a major consideration, and I don't think we're doing as much as we could in that area.
And that's also, you're saying, is a harder area to measure?
Well, I think that you can measure it, and Coco can talk about the past efforts to measure or to survey our employees in terms of job satisfaction, again, what tools they need and so on to do their jobs more effectively. Since I've been at the department, we have not done one.
The last time we did an employee survey, we also survey not just our employees, but we also survey kind of our external customers, so to say. And I think the last time we did an employee survey was in 2006 or 2007, and an external survey around that time as well. So it's been a couple of years, and we're trying to do different ways without the cost of a full survey to try to get a pulse of what's happening in our organization as it relates to some of the challenges that Marty identified.
I'd love to move our discussion toward how we, toward our next steps and how we drive this to creating a template that'll be useful to us in the legislature. Ideally, in some ways, you've got these 55 measurements. How do we roll those up into 2 or 3? And what would those be? We don't have to come to a consensus on that. But and part of this will be having a discussion after the fact on the staff level. But I wanted to get your thoughts about that. I mean, I could see us doing something with congestion and infrastructure, project costs. But those are sort of my arbitrary ideas. I mean, what do you think, if we were trying to roll this up into something that would be a template, what would it look like? Well, and members can chime in too. I really want this to be a discussion and not, move it more toward that. But go ahead.
I would just say the task is difficult, although we wouldn't shy away from it. This is a timely request. The fact that we are engaged with all of our districts and our external partners on this performance or program review will raise this issue. But at the same time, transportation mobility is pretty complex. It's not simply highways or the maintenance of highways or the few focus routes. I mean, it's a multimodal effort across a very, very large state. For us to come with 2 or 3 magical performance measures, it will be difficult, but we could make that attempt.
Mr. Nielsen, and then...
Well, on that point, I talked a bit ago about process, and I think that's important. If we're going to be meaningfully moving ahead, the Budget Committee and agencies, then we need to have some regular meetings and some regular conclusions. And I would pick maybe one of your priorities here that we've discussed today for us in the short period of time to really grab onto. The condition of the highway, safety, something like that. Not a whole array of ones, but maybe we would agree on one thing for the next 3 weeks, month, 2 months, whatever, and really do some in-depth work on that and come up with some conclusions related to that point. I think that would be a very good place to start, and that's manageable instead of taking the whole panoply of things and trying to wrap our arms around it. Make that a consideration, if you would, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Buchanan, I'm sorry.
It's okay, go ahead.
Mr. Gordon.
Sorry. When we worked on this in the county government I came from, the one thing we did was we made sure that agencies and departments kept their full list. We didn't want them to not collect information on the 55 measures you collect, but we also asked them to help us think about how we get to 2 or 3 headline measures. You know, what are the 2 or 3 things that over the next year or two we want to focus on and look at and think about. Those measures, headline measures, might change over time, but it provided a way to roll up some of that data. You still had the baseline data, you still had the information you could drill down into, but in terms of facilitating the conversation, that seemed to be a helpful way to go. As it relates to our process, my hope is that that in some of our budget subcommittees, and I'm not sure that given the workload in all, but that in some of them we might be able to begin some conversations along these lines. I think that we have to work both at this level, in this subcommittee, maybe setting some templates, maybe thinking about some things, then rolling that back into the other budget subs for a little bit further work, and then bring that back here, kind of, here's what we've discovered so far, here's what we found. Almost an iterative process in some way that might be helpful. So those are my comments.
Ms. Buchanan.
Yeah, I agree that probably the most appropriate place would be to start with the budget subs, since those are the people who theoretically are going to dig down or drill down more into those areas. But, I think if I were looking at what we're talking about in terms of goals, in terms of what both the LAO and you laid out in your PowerPoint, I mean, I'm not sure I'd come up with any different metrics, I mean, obviously safety, maintenance, mobility, I mean, those are the metrics. Now, I understand that something like mobility, whether it's your job or the CTC's job or whoever, I mean, that's a much bigger picture. But in terms of ultimately, what are you going to be the big items you're measuring? Mm-hmm. The hours and stuff, that's fine. And then for each of those major areas, I wouldn't want to report this big, but something that could drill down into other, key factors, so that I would want to have some kind of big picture outlook. That's why I talked about, it's sort of like for those areas that we don't feel are the safest areas of traffic, or we've got excessive accidents or fatalities. What are we going to do? And I would hope that you would be looking at things like I said, where it's barriers, does it make a difference if you've got rubberized or asphalt or whatever. but also having the big picture on the maintenance, what we're doing and what we're not doing, because we need, ultimately as a legislature, that's a policy decision we've got to make in terms of how much money we want to spend and what it costs us to spend today versus waiting till tomorrow when the roads are so deteriorated and have so many potholes or whatever that you spend the $6 or $10. So I myself, maybe there are more, but I think you've come up with great objectives here. We just need to drill down a little bit more so we have a little bit better data, and then ultimately, I won't say it again in one sentence, we have to be sure that the cost numbers are accurate so that when we're trying to make fiscal decisions, we know we're basing them on the best numbers we have.
I like what you're all saying, and it's an interesting idea. And keying off something Mr. Gordon said about getting the subcommittees to sort of roll them out for each of the departments. We picked you first, frankly, because we thought this would be the easiest agency in some ways to do because you do have so much data. But then the other challenge would be to roll this up in some sort of consistent pattern, template, if you will, but of categories that we could have across all issue areas that we fill in the blanks on the various things so that we can scale this at some point. But
you could take a couple. Once you've done them, and let people could take a look at them.
Yeah, and I think that's the idea of this, to start out with the easier ones that have the data, and then move from there.
Yeah, I just also want to say though that when I look at performance-based budgeting, as much as helping the legislature, I would hope that what you do already, I would think, helps you make better decisions about how you're allocating your resources, because ultimately you're the ones closest to the job, and you're the ones that have to do that. I know when we went to more, I'm just going to use a different phrase, data-driven type decision-making in our school district. People would say, well, such and such, and we'd say, well, so what do the numbers show? And they go back and look at the numbers, and sometimes it was a real aha moment because it wasn't happening that way. So using data to help you make decisions, ultimately, I would hope would help you manage better and then give us better information.
Mr. Gordon.
And do one other thing, and that is provide the public with a better understanding of how their tax dollars are benefiting them. If we can show that we're using their tax dollars effectively for road maintenance in a way that's positive, I think that helps folks better understand what their state government is doing.
And the other one, and part of this is just a brainstorming session in a public manner, is that I would love to see, in addition to the data points and the goals, but also sort of a baseline self-assessment from each. So so year over year or month over month, we're able to know, are we doing better now than we were 6 months ago? And there's no scale for that necessarily, but to create a scale for that. And it almost doesn't matter what the scale is, because what's important is how we're doing relative to how we were doing in the past. But to have that in a more general sense versus the 55 different data points, we're up here, we're down here. But I think it would be useful to know on a variety of levels to have that sense that we're going in the right direction, or we're not going in the right direction because we don't have the money. As you mentioned, you were talking about the big gap between the maintenance of our roads, of what we need and what we have. But that doesn't necessarily happen at the beginning of a subcommittee hearing. That's usually not the discussion. The discussion is this is what we need to move to that next step, but that we never get that step back. So I think having, and I don't know the right term for it, but in addition to the performance measures, having a baseline assessment and some sort of universal scale maybe for all departments, but clearly it's a relative scale, so it's scoring a 73 in transportation may not be the same as scoring a 73 in Health and Human Services, but it will still be instructive to know a year from now, 2 years from now, whether you're at 75, 77, or 22, or whatever the scale may be. Are there any other thoughts or ideas that anybody wants to bounce around on this topic? It's a good. I think we've had a good discussion so far. I'd like to sort of direct the staff in the LAO and Department of Finance and Caltrans to work together prior to our next meeting to help put together the type of template that we're talking about. As an idea, I think there's been a lot of suggestions out there, and maybe also this baseline measurement that I'm talking about. I think that would be a good, concrete step for the next thing. Mr. Nielsen, did you?
And Mr. Chairman, if we could focus on maybe one item too, that we try to come to some kind of conclusion prior to the budget subcommittee's meeting, so that could be presented. I mean, that would be one thing we can really get our hands on quickly.
Yeah, I'm all for. I mean, you're just sort of picking a guaranteed item. We're going to have several, but we can decide on one. I mean, we talked about mobility, we talked about congestion, we talked about maintenance. I mean, any of those particular. I mean, I'll defer to our sub chair for the first.
I think. I'm sorry. Thank you. There's probably some bang for our buck if we start looking at maintenance. It also, I mean, it does link at some point back to safety. So maybe that might be an interesting place to explore.
That's always the biggest complaint we get. I call it the pothole syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And polling has showed the public wants you, 1, to maintain your roads, 2, they want more mass transportation, and 3, then they want new roads. So if we're responding to a public need, maintenance, I think, is their number 1 priority. They want.
Okay. So in addition to directing the staff to do what we just talked about, if we could also be very clear that we want to have the specifics for maintenance in terms of the measurements, and that'll be for either for our next hearing or actually probably the more immediate one is for your first sub 3 meeting, to have it ready for that, and then you'll share it with the committee. Sorry.
I'll definitely work with staff on that in terms of sub 3.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments before we close this hearing from any of the members or panelists? Then thank you all very much for coming and being part of this discussion.